As I mentioned at the end of the last session, the rise and the beginning of the university movement continued to help spread the ideas behind scholasticism. There were several different schools of scholasticism that developed at this time, um, and from these different schools, there were different ideas that developed. There was the school of realism, developed by Anselm, which suggested, I believe, in order that I may know, and universals exist before created things. Moderate realism as a school, which became the most popular of the three, was started by Abelard and continued by Thomas Aquinas. I know in order that I may believe, and universals exist in individual things. And then finally, you had the nominalist movement, espoused by William of Ockham. What I believe is separate from what I know. I think you can see at least some of the subtle differences between these three schools of scholasticism and how they tried to develop um, you know, a theology, if you will, based on Aristotelian logic. And um, so with these three different schools, I think you can begin to see, based on this question I'm posing here, um, these different camps led to different ideas within the Christianity regarding the role of the church. Aquinas emphasized the subordination of the individual to the institution of the church, while William of Ockham developed the idea that the individual was, in a sense, over the institution, lessening the influence of the church. So I think you can see the significance of how those two different ideas influenced Christianity in Europe at that time. Um, a little bit later, you begin to see, really, as a result of the spread of scholasticism, you see the rise of mysticism. Scholasticism primarily focused on the head, but ignored the heart. Mysticism offered something that appealed to the individual, offering an intimate and direct connection with God, which was significant and important, especially for our understanding of renewal Christianity. So, causes for the rise of mysticism. Certainly, it was a protest against scholasticism. It was also a reaction against the corruption and formalism of the church, which was often a complaint that led to renewal throughout church history. When we look at it in the Montanists and in later renewal movements, but certainly we see it in mysticism as well. Also, the Black Death or the Black Plague. Really was another reason for the rise of mysticism, because over a third of Europe died as a result of the Black Death or the Black Plague. And finally, the Babylonian captivity and the great schism of the church that occurred during this time period led to questioning spiritual leadership and the desire for a direct connection with God. In the Babylonian captivity, the spiritual authority of the church that had rested in Rome with the Pope in Rome was, for a period of time, because of politics, was moved to Avignon, France. And this led eventually to a situation where there were two different popes, one in Avignon, France, and one in Rome. And then ultimately, in the Great Schism, it led to three different popes at one period in time, which again significantly lessened the authority of the church, and it led to renewal, even a greater desire for renewal, as people desired a direct connection with God. There were several different types of mystics. There were Latin mystics that emphasized a personal emotional experience, a oneness of affection with Christ. Bernard of Clairvaux, who I already talked about, certainly was perhaps one of the most significant leaders of the Latin mystical movement, and also Catherine of Siena, whom I already mentioned. You also had the Teutonic mystics like Meister Eckhart that said God must become I and I God. And he believed in a fusion between the human essence and the divine essence, which was not without its own controversy, theologically speaking, but it was influential. One of Eckhart's followers wrote a book called German Theology, which Martin Luther found helpful in his own spiritual journey towards salvation. And in the Netherlands, the mystical movement was known as the Brethren of the Common Life, very influential in European Christianity. And one member of this movement, Thomas à Kempis, was credited with authoring the book, The Imitation of Christ. This book was the most popular and widely read book for the next 500 years. It was so popular, not only in influencing the Protestant Reformation, but renewal movements for the next few centuries. So there are pros and cons to the medieval mystical movement. Was it a reaction against formalism, dry scholasticism? Can you think of earlier movements that reacted against this formalism? And certainly I pointed already to one, but try and think of other movements as well. But also, when we look at scholasticism and mysticism, how can we have a sense of balance in our pursuit of orthodoxy, right doctrine, and our pursuit of orthopathy, right heart, or right connection with God? I think scholasticism, in a way, was trying to find truth, trying to pursue orthodoxy, but was it doing it at the expense of orthopathy? And at the same time, was mysticism pursuing orthopathy at the expense of orthodoxy? In some cases, I'd have to say, yes, it was. We have to ask those questions today when we consider the renewal movement and renewal theology today. There were other significant renewal leaders of this period: Bonaventure, Hildegard of Bingen, Birgitta of Sweden, who it is said spoke in tongues, Gregory of Palamas, who was influential in extending the ideas of Simeon the New Theologian, and Nicholas Cabasilas, who was also a very charismatic, prophetic, gifted leader, emphasized the casting out of demons, the spiritual gifts in the Eastern Church, and once again continued that legacy of spiritual renewal and the emphasis of the holiness, or the emphasis of the Holy Spirit in the Eastern Church during this time period. You can certainly read more about the first three in your text with in your text with Stanley Burgess. I encourage you to look at the other two online to find out more about them. But I think that ends our time looking at the medieval movement and the renewal movements of this time period. We're going to begin next week with looking at some of the predecessors of the Protestant Reformation and how they helped bring about renewal leading up to the Reformation. I look forward to our discussion this week and seeing you next week as well. Have a great week.